Hello everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host Ricardo Lopes and today I'm here with Dr. Christophe Heintz. He is Associate Professor at the Central European University where he leads the research group ACE, that is Adaptive Cognition and Economics. Dr. Heintz is working on the role of adaptive cognition in shaping economic behavior, cultural evolution and the history of science. Scientific practices and economic choices have traditionally been described as rational, and that's something we're going to talk about today, and the attempts to describe them as resulting from both environmental/contextual and psychological causal factors with a focus on evolved cognition. So, Dr. Heintz, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Okay, so in the introduction I mentioned adaptive cognition. Could you tell us first what adaptive cognition is?
Yes, so in some sense, all cognition from organisms is adaptive. So it's pointing out, it's emphasizing the adaptive aspect of cognition when cognition is implemented by brains, that is, by cognitive devices for organisms. So if you have you couldn't characterize another computational device such as a computer as adaptive. It has been programmed by someone. Its goal is not to optimize fitness. Brains, by contrast, are organs, and as organs, you can understand their function as mainly being optimizing inclusive fitness. And this is the idea that comes with adaptive cognition, that if you want to understand, if you want to do psychology, it's a good starting point to assume that the cognitive functions are adaptive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they are basically the result of the selective pressures we've been exposed to during our evolutionary history and the kinds of things or aspects of the environment that they are adapted to, correct?
Yes, absolutely. You have many interviewees that talk about evolution, and here I refer obviously to biological evolution, yes.
Mm-hmm. And evolutionary psychology in this case, correct?
Which points to evolutionary psychology. Indeed, evolutionary biological evolution applied to cognition gives evolutionary psychology, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what are some of the aspects of our evolved cognition that you focus your work the most on while you're trying to understand a little bit better how scientific practices developed and how we make our economic choices, for example?
Yes, so it's not a very good answer that I'm going to give, because for scientific cognition in particular, one of the things that I try to emphasize is that there is no one specific cognitive capacity that is used and recruited specifically for thinking scientifically. When we think in science, we will recruit many, if not all, of our cognitive capacities, our inferential devices. And it is only on case-to-case basis that you will be able to see which cognitive capacity is being recruited. So, for instance, in one of my case studies in mathematics, and surprisingly, I was interested in number cognition, what kind of cognitive capacities are being recruited for thinking about quantities, evolved capacities for thinking about quantities, how they can be used to make inferences in mathematics. That was one of the questions. But more, you can have simpler examples, such as visual cognition. When you look at graphs, you have one other example that I have been developing a bit, and I'm still working a bit on that with a student, is the role of mind-reading capacities. So our capacity to ascribe intentions, beliefs, and so on to others for doing social anthropology. So you go to the fields, and one of the things that you need to do is to make sense of others. And a claim that we make is that, well, when we do that, we recruit one specific evolved cognitive capacity, which is our mind reading capacity.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. So, I mean, science, we usually describe it as a rational enterprise, let's say, but we also have to take into account some cognitive mechanisms that we have evolved, otherwise we can't understand how it has developed over time. And I mean, in different disciplines, probably different cognitive mechanisms are applied.
Exactly. That's and across history. So if you look at mathematics, Greek mathematicians, they would rely enormously on visual cognition. In the 20th century, that's something you shouldn't do. Visual cognition can still have some heuristic value. So you have to do a proof in geometry. You help yourself by drawing a figure, but you cannot use it in the proof. So it has only a heuristic value. That was not the case in Greek mathematics. Demonstrations, you could show things. So there is an evolution of how capacities are recruited in scientific practice. And I think that's one of the really, really interesting aspects of the evolution of science, is to try to understand what cognitive practices relying on which cognitive capacity is being legitimated during the evolution through other type of beliefs that are epistemic beliefs. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And otherwise, there is, of course, reason that will play a role, and I think that you will have further questions about reasons later on, so I don't want to.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and we will come back to some more questions about science later on in the interview, but let me just ask you, and since you mentioned the history of the development of science in this case, what is cognitive history?
So what? Yes, it's a bit like adaptive cognition. It is not intended to characterize, a field precisely. It's just meant to say that, well, if you are doing history, looking at cognitive psychology might be of relevance and of interest. You can contrast it, on the other hand, with psychological history. Psychological history, you will look at the psychological process of specific located individuals, historical figures of interest. And for instance, Stefan Zweig is writing novels that are wonderful because he picks a historical figure and he goes into the mind of the historical figure, talking about the type of emotions that would have motivated this person. Cognitive history might be a bit more boring. It's looking at the general properties of the mind and how these general properties might have caused some historical features, some historical phenomena. So there are features of the human mind that have an influence on a large set of historical phenomena. Olivier Morin will be focusing on this kind of aspects. So he has been looking at, one example is, he has been looking at scripts, at writing systems, and he looks at commonalities into these writing systems. And what he sees is that most writing systems have vertical and horizontal lines being overrepresented. And this is a historical phenomenon. That's a cultural and historical phenomenon. And it is best accounted for by some aspect of visual cognition, a preference for these type of lines, vertical and horizontal. It's easier to process. So that's one type of cognitive history. And another type of cognitive history would be to look at the cognitive factors that are more local. Olivier Morin is focusing on cognitive factors that are rather universal, shared, that we can expect to see everywhere. But there are also cognitive factors that you can that are more local factors. So one example would be specific religious beliefs at one point in history. Mm-hmm. And those specific beliefs will be there will be factors of attraction towards these beliefs. I'm talking about religious beliefs. That's not one of my specialty. Let me go back to scientific beliefs. One of the really fascinating phenomenon in the history of science is the fact that is multiple independent discoveries of the same thing, and sometimes it is really very striking. It seems that there is a teleological aspect to science, that there is we are just going towards the truth. A more causal explanation is to say, well, there are cognitive factors of attraction that will lead to this type of belief formation.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps two good examples of that would be when, back in the 18th century, I think it was back then, that Leibniz and Newton developed calculus, and in the 19th century another example would be Charles Darwin, and I think his name was Alfred Wallace, right, that both at the same time, or more or less at the same time, developed the theory of evolution by natural selection.
Yes. Another case that was of specific interest to me was the discovery of the concept of limits, mm-hmm. Which was discovered something like 2 or 3 times. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so we have to take into account here, while focusing on these different questions, trying to understand how, for example, these different scientific disciplines evolved. We have to take into account aspects of our evolved psychology, but also environmental and contextual factors, because I mean the fact that, for example, Leibniz and Newton both developed calculus more or less at the same time. I mean, we have also a cultural context for that, correct?
Of course, absolutely. So that goes back to also an aspect of cultural epidemiology or cultural attraction theory that would use a lot of insights from evolutionary psychology, but that also would recognize, well, first of all, that there is a lot of learning and that the cultural environment will play an important role. So for these scientific discoveries, of course, there is a lot of scaffolding, cultural scaffolding of what many scientists have in their mind. And you have new factors, cognitive factors of attraction, only because there is this similar scaffoldings across a community of scientists.
Mm-hmm. And those scaffoldings would correspond to what exactly? Would they correspond to cognitive mechanisms that are at the basis of a cultural transmission, for example? Or?
No, what I have in mind by scaffoldings is how you recruit your evolved cognitive capacities. You use them to learn. You use them to make them specific inferences, and this is a practice. So for when you come to learn numbers, this is something that most people of your community will do, and in fact there are several traditions about how to learn numbers. Japanese, Chinese have different ways to learn numbers, but in the end we have similar cognitive capacities that are both entrenched in evolved cognitive endowments and also culturally implemented through learning. So that's what I mean by scaffolding. Number cognition is scaffolded upon both evolved cognitive capacities and learning process, cultural process, because we do all these practices of learning.
So in cultural epidemiology or cultural attraction theory, the ways by which different aspects of culture, like let's say, would attract others depends in each case or is based on different cognitive mechanisms that apply in each specific case.
Yeah, so absolutely. So one of the aspects of cultural epidemiology is that for each case, you need to identify the causal processes that leads to stabilization. You do not give yourself the right to assume that, let's say, it's replication. You have to go there and check what to zoom in the cognitive causal chains, as Dan Sperber called them, to zoom in those chains in order to see what cognitive processes are implemented that lead to stabilization.
And is it called cultural attraction theory because, for example, in certain ways when we learn or acquire some information from culture, like for example numeracy, it's easier for us to pick up on other things, in this case related to numbers, and learn them?
Yes. Okay, so a bit of history of science about cultural attraction theory. Okay. So it's cultural attraction theory is a theory about culture that has several aspects. One of them is population thinking. You want to think of culture as elements, as distribution of tokens in a community and its environment. So it's a framework, it's a theoretical framework that belongs to approaches of culture, evolutionary approaches to culture. That's the first thing. Now, what happened? Initially, it was called cultural epidemiology or epidemiology of representations. It went through different names. And then what happened is that among the theories of cultural evolution, there is a major one, a standard one, that suggests to assume that there is a process of replication. And that through this process of replication of cultural items, you can get cultural phenomena. And with regard to this standard view, cultural attraction theory says, oh, maybe not. Maybe there is no one entity, cognitive entity, that has as a function to evolve cognitive mechanisms that has as a function to replicate cultural items. It's not like biological evolution, sexual reproduction. You have mechanisms whose function is replication. But for the cognitive apparatus, it seems that there is no cognitive mechanisms whose function is replication. That would not really make sense, in fact, to evolve such a mechanism. So if you do not have such an evolved mechanism, what you need to do is to find out what are these mechanisms. You cannot black box and say, well, we don't really know, but let's assume that there is replication. You can do that when you are Darwin, because there is a functional entity, there is a functional process, a functional mechanism of replication. You don't exactly know how this functional process works, but there is one. With human cognition, we have evidence that, well, we have good reasons to think that there is no such evolved mechanisms. So you need to get back to the causal processes. You cannot black box the causal processes. And when you get to the causal processes, what you need to do is to focus, to zoom in again, as I mentioned, on the cognitive processes. And a bet that is done is that the stabilization will be obtained by means of attraction. And attraction is a statistical process that assumes that with a relatively diverse input, you will get to the same output. So, for instance, you are learning a special technique, so how to shoot an arrow, for instance. You can have a clumsy demonstrator. In spite of learning from a clumsy demonstrator, you will achieve something better, a better technique. There is a factor of attraction towards efficiency. And so that's how you learn how to shoot an arrow. Myself, I have a very good teacher, and in the end, there is a high probability that we end up with very similar technique. Mm-hmm. So this is what attraction is about. There is a diversity of input, and then nonetheless some identity in the output. Mm-hmm. that enable stabilization of cultural and thus cultural phenomena.
Mm-hmm. And still within the rubric of cognitive history, what is the importance of distributed cognition in this case?
That's a hard story. Okay, so well, first of all, when you look at cognitive history, you will see that cognitive processes happen everywhere. If you want to account for a cultural phenomenon, you have cognitive processes everywhere within the brains, but also outside of the brains. Literacy, the existence of books, for instance, is a case. Is an easy case to understand. So cognition is distributed in the sense that it is distributed across multiple minds. It is distributed in some tokens, and out of that you get cognitive chains that cut across individuals, external devices, and across individuals, etc., etc. What is, I think, an interesting topic of investigation is to look when you have cognitive systems that evolve. So the fact that cognition is distributed, it's already there in the idea of cognitive chains, cultural cognitive chains, for instance. What is not there is the idea that there are cognitive systems, cognitive distributed systems. And that's one of the interesting insights of Hutchins, who will look at navigation as a distributed cognitive systems. And it is this systematic aspect that the evolution of these systems that I think is of interest and the puzzle for the historians. It goes towards an understanding of the evolution of some specific institutions that are best understood as having a cognitive functions. So navigation, for instance, you can say it is an institution. You have practices that are regulated. There are norms about how you can go around navigating. So they are institutions, and their function is to output a representation about the location of the ship. So it is a cognitive process. So that is my how I can describe my interest in distributed cognitive system. I have one specific case study, which is the evolution again in science, which is the evolution of cognitive one specific distributed cognitive system that whose output was the proof of the four-color theorem. And this distributed cognitive system involved two mathematicians, a programmer, and a computer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, this view that we usually have of the history of science being composed by different individuals, different geniuses coming up with ideas, like, I mean, like if they're working just by themselves and developing these ideas, this is not a reasonable one to have, or a realistic one, because I guess that most of what they did came from the types of processes that we've been talking about, right?
Yes, well, I have myself an admiration. It's very difficult not to admire some incredible, great scientists, some geniuses. So there is no doubt that some people have had incredible cognitive achievements. But for a historian, it is always very, very interesting to see how they managed to have these incredible achievements. And the best explanation is to look at the cultural context, indeed, and to show how the cultural context enabled these achievements. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and let's talk now about reasoning. So first of all, what is reasoning about? When we mentioned reasoning in science, in scientific processes, and as a cognitive mechanism, let's say, what are we referring to?
So, well, that's one of the problem with reasoning, is that many people will refer to different things. So one of the key work of Dan Sperber and Hugo Mercier was to provide a characterization that is of interest for understanding human cognition in an evolutionary perspective, and to pin down what could be the function of reasoning, to pin down a plausible function of reasoning. So, first of all, what is it that we want to talk about? We could talk about rationality, but then that's too big. In fact, rationality means that is better characterized as ecological rationality, that would point out that your cognitive capacities are adapted. We go back to adaptive cognition. You could say adaptive cognition is the same as ecological rationality. We have a cognitive apparatus that does its function properly. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you assume rationality is that you assume that this cognitive capacity is pretty functional. Mm-hmm. So that's an idea of rationality. You can equate reasoning with rationality, but then you have to admit that all organisms are rational. Mm-hmm. So that's not helping for understanding some of our ideas about reason that relate to human-specific capacities. Mm-hmm. So a more specific characterization is to look at this practice that humans have to justify themselves. Mm-hmm. Humans spend a lot of time thinking about justifications and providing justifications to others. And this process of justification, of looking for justification, is what Mercier and Sperber will identify as reasoning. And I think that it is a productive, so I buy it because I think it is a productive characterization. It has some consequences. Some consequences is that it is one adaptive capacity among others. And it has a specific function, which is to argument with others, to justify oneself to others. So it is a social competence. That's one of the consequence that is a bit unorthodox with regard to how people have been thinking about reasoning so far.
Yeah, because in this case, reasoning is not asocial. I mean, many times people, when they talk about reason or rationality, I mean, people use different words as well. Many times they are equating it with a sort of cognitive mechanism that we have, that if we put it into practice, we will get, even by ourselves, to objective truth or something like that. Right.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that goes back to one of your earlier observation about the scientist's reasoning. The scientist's reasoning is a scientist that will try to justify some of his beliefs, recruiting premises that will be acceptable to his peers, he or her peers. And so we get something that is that characterize the activity of the scientists pretty well, but that shows how social it is. Mm-hmm. It means convincing your peers, finding out the type of premises that they will accept.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in your work, I've also read about folk epistemology. So what is it about?
Well, yes. There is a bit. It's always a bit. There is always a bit of a terminological issue. By folk epistemology, we wanted to refer to cultural beliefs about knowledge and how you acquire this knowledge. And in science, it is something that philosophers of science have eventually observed, that these epistemic beliefs have evolved in the history of science. I mentioned mathematics, the role of visual of drawings in doing a proof. There is also the role of computers in doing a proof that is also at stake. So these ideas about how you actually acquire genuine knowledge is susceptible to cultural variations, mm-hmm. but it is also strongly constrained by our cognitive evolved cognitive endowment. And it is a question how constrained it is, what are the constraints, and I don't have a clear-cut answer to this aspect. But one way to look, one direction to look is to reasoning, argumentative capacities of reasoning. You want to convince others, and by what means? You cannot convince others by any type of means. There are things that are more convincing than others. Mm-hmm. So if we look at these practices, then we can get a better understanding of how folk epistemic beliefs might culturally evolve and how constrained they are.
Mm-hmm. So folk epistemology is what the beliefs that people hold about how we acquire knowledge. Is that
absolutely? So in some culture, for instance, there is another example. I gave you an example with science. Another example is the fact that in some cultures, people are really convinced, or they are convinced. They will state that it is impossible to understand what others think. The mind of others is completely opaque. So if you make a claim about what others think, it is bound to be taken with a lot of skepticism. It's you find that in some cultures. You don't find that as strongly in some other cultures. Mm-hmm. So there is some variations about how beliefs about how much we can access the mind of others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And could you tell us a little bit about what is the role that institutions play in cultural evolution?
Yeah, so let's go back to, again, terminological issues. What is an institution? Yeah. It's a difficult term. It has been used in several ways. Some would use it as a social organization. Others would have more lax characterization as just rules that are adopted by most people in the community. The characterization that I think is quite fruitful is, again, taken from Sperber. It's regulative representations. You have institutions when there are regulative representations. Regulative representations are rules, but rules about cognitive practices. So let's go back to Hutchins and navigation. Here you have an institution because you have rules about how to navigate. There is, so for American ships, you have a book that will tell you what kind of instruments you have to use, how to use these instruments, etc., etc. So you have a set of regulative representations, and that makes it that makes navigation an institution. So institution in that sense are representations that will contribute to the stabilization of other representations that they will be constitutive of cultural phenomena. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the effects of institutions. And then, of course, once you have understood what stabilize some specific beliefs, and you say, well, this is because there are other representations that regulate their distribution, then you have partially answered the question about why you have, let's say, these practices in navigation, and you need to get at the other level. How often the regulative representations are themselves stabilized? How often that there is this book about how to navigate that is successful, that is reproduced, printed again and again. And now I'm going back to this notion of distributed cognitive system. Often the answer is functional. It is because they achieve they achieve a function that these specific institutions that are themselves distributed cognitive systems might stabilize. Okay, so the regulative representations stabilize because, in our case, the navigation system works well. So it has a function. And we can get back to some functionalism in the social science, which is an idea that was that has been pretty controversial some time ago. Functionalism in the social science, and that, in my view, could get some renewal with well, in particular, this idea that there are evolution of distributed cognitive systems.
Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, I guess that one very important ingredient here in regards to institutions and other sorts of human social organizations, let's say, is the role that trust plays, correct?
Yes, absolutely. When you have a distributed cognitive system, you have elements that will take as their inputs the output of another device. So when you use your computer, you trust the input to your brain is the output of the computer, and you will do that because you trust that the computer has a relevant output for you to process. So that's the type of trust that is at work in distributed cognitive systems, and the evolution of distributed cognitive systems is the advent of this practice. And often you start by being skeptical about the trustworthiness of a cognitive entity. You evaluate it, and it's only when you are really confident that it is a trustworthy cognitive device, that it performs sufficiently reliably its cognitive function, that you will establish the system by trusting. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so before we go back to science, let me just ask you about your work on economic choices. So, do we already know what are the evolved, or what are the aspects of our evolved cognition that play a role in how we make economic choices?
Do we know everything? No, not yet. There is plenty of things to discover. There are two key research projects for understanding economic choices with evolutionary psychology. The first one is to make a connection with the systematic study in behavioral economics of cognitive biases. Cognitive biases are systematic departure from the prediction of the Homo economicus. You start by assuming that agents will make choices that are rational as described by the theory of rational choice theory. You start with these assumptions, you see that there is systematic departure, and then you call that a cognitive bias. So, one example of cognitive bias is the sunk cost fallacy. You make a decision about how to invest, not in view of your future prospect, but in view of your past investments. And this is not rational, because it's not the way to maximize your future benefits. Yeah. You should just focus on your future benefits, not on your past action. So the sunk cost fallacy, an example of sunk cost fallacy, you bought your train ticket to go to Vienna. Now it turns out that you are sick. You know that you will not enjoy your stay in Vienna, but you nonetheless go to Vienna because you paid your train ticket. And it is a fallacy because anyway, you bought it. You lost the money of the train ticket. It's not, you do not recover the money of the train ticket by using it. Mm-hmm. So once I have illustrated this idea of cognitive bias, what can evolutionary psychology do now? Is to understand these biases, not so much as a list of malfunctioning of the human brain, but rather as resulting as signature of adaptive cognitive processes. So that's one research program that I see that is of interest. Getting back to the sunk cost fallacy, one of the studies that I did was in comparative psychology, mm-hmm. where we look at sunk cost fallacy in non-humans, non-human primates, chimpanzees. And here, one of the questions is, the main question is, do we share the cognitive processes that lead to make the sunk cost fallacy with other species, or is it the result of human-specific cognitive capacity? Mm-hmm. Myself, I had hypothesized that it was a result of a some human-specific capacity, namely reasoning. I thought that it was a result of some reasoning biases. It turns out that I'm most probably mistaken, because we document the sunk cost fallacy in non-human primates, and assuming that non-human primates are not reasoning, they don't feel compelled to justify their choices, then we can conclude that the sunk cost fallacy originates in some other cognitive processes. It's not what some economists have called reason-based choice. Mm-hmm. So that's one research subfield. Another research subfield of that is pretty dynamic is to understand, to recover some really relevant motivations of humans that lead them to cooperate the way we see them cooperating. So that's the second trend of research, not just about belief formation, about choices, but about motivations. So you can investigate all type of motivations that lead to economic choice. If you're hungry, you are going to buy food. But one interesting puzzle, a crucial puzzle, is cooperation. And the question is to look at the proximal mechanisms, the specific type of motivations that people have when they are cooperating. And it is interesting because you have this constraint that in the end, the motivation or the preference, what produces the motivation that you observe is itself adaptive. It is an adaptive mechanism. And that's one of the crucial challenge in behavior, in evolutionary psychology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So let's go back to science. So you've already gave some examples of cognitive mechanisms that we deploy in science in very specific instances, let's say. So generally speaking, would you say that science is mostly the result of social and cultural processes, or something else?
Well, science is a cultural phenomenon, so that's I don't think there is much more to say. It's a cultural phenomenon, but it involves people thinking. So cognitive psychology is bound to be highly relevant to understanding this cultural phenomenon, as it is for understanding other cultural phenomena.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so let me just ask you one last thing. Do we already know if there are some general evolved cognitive mechanisms that play a role in scientific thinking, in general, without having to look into each specific discipline or field?
Yeah, so I mentioned reasoning. Because scientific practice involves convincing your peers, then reasoning is something that will obviously play an important role in scientific practices. Yes, mm-hmm. But it does so it's not a necessary and sufficient condition for scientific thinking. Mm-hmm. It is de facto involved a lot in scientific practices. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that science is rational as people usually describe it, or do you think that we should look at it in another way?
Yeah, I think for all the reasons we specified so far, I think it's not a good question to ask whether science is rational or not. The frog is rational. So it will not help to characterize science to say that it is something rational. I'm not, I don't want to enter into the debate about whether science is a good thing or a bad thing. I think it produces wonderful things. I would say that the proof is in the pudding with science. Philosophers of science have worked a lot on finding out a demarcation that would allow you to distinguish what is scientific from what is not scientific. It has been a long, hard process that didn't lead to finding the Graal. And that goes back also to this idea that the epistemic beliefs in science have evolved themselves. Mm-hmm. There is an evolution of epistemic beliefs. So we need to be quite open-minded about what is science.
Let me just
without solving the demarcation problem about, well, science is good and pseudoscience is not good, we still have plenty of reasons to be optimistic about science. And we just need to open our eyes and see that it accomplishes marvels.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that in science there has been also an evolution of epistemic beliefs. What do you mean by that, and what would those epistemic beliefs be?
Yes, so epistemic beliefs are belief about the practice, procedures that provide sufficient warrant for your beliefs. Mm-hmm. That they are about the practices of justification. Mm-hmm. And these practices of justification have known some evolution. I think that historians and sociologists of science have been incredibly good these last 50 years in pointing out the evolution of epistemic practices. The example that I gave several times is the role of visual cognition in mathematics. There are other studies about what is a valid testimony. Do you need to be a gentleman, for instance, in order to provide sufficient ground to a testimony? Nowadays, there are really an interesting debate about statistical proofs, the role of p-values. So the p-value, which has been in psychology the golden standard, is now looked down upon. Mm-hmm. And there is here an evolution of epistemic belief about what best way you have to demonstrate that the psychological effect that you have observed does indeed exist, with either using p-values or other statistical method. Bayesian data analysis is somewhat taking over. This is also, again, an example of evolution of epistemic belief and epistemic practices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, we've had recently the replication crisis in many scientific disciplines, and that would be another good example of how people looked back on their own practices in several different fields of science, and they are rethinking how they should approach things, right?
Absolutely, and this is incredibly fruitful. So we tend to be depressed about the fact that there is a replication crisis. Another more optimistic way to think to see it is that it leads us to challenge our own epistemic practices, and these epistemic practices evolve, and hopefully for the better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Heintz, let's end the interview here. Just before we go, would you like to refer to some of the best places on the internet for people to find your work?
Yes, that would be my website, which is Christophe Heintz .free.fr.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and do you have any social media? Do you use Twitter or not?
Well, I am on Twitter. I should participate more and have some Twitter and tweet a bit more. I haven't been very active on that.
Yeah. Okay, so I will be leaving links to your work, to your website and Twitter handle in the description box of this interview. And Dr. Heintz, thank you again for taking the time to come on the show. It was really fun to talk to you.
Thank you very much. That was really wonderful to talk to you too.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel back in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. And to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. And I also have links to PayPal in the description box of the interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and main supporters, Karin Litska and Blanchett, Perga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Greg Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Anian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Enric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windeger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Marco Neves, Max Bailby, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugney, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Felicia Stevens, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Leibrant, Oslem Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, and Yacila Deza Araújo. My producers, Isar Weber, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Dr. Ian Gilligan, Sergio Quadriano, Luís Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Van Egdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, and my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.